So, what was life like for um, women in this environment at the turn of the century, in this middle class and upper class environment? Well, it's a time period which we refer to what happened previously, the Victorian time period. We're talking about Queen Victoria, who dies in 1901, is associated with certain cultural and social mores of the time period. And what was considered proper and the rules of propriety and such, these governed the lives of young women and ladies in a very strict sense throughout Europe, from Russia to Great Britain. And there are various permutations of this type of propriety, but there were certain similarities. One is the decision of how and when a woman would be married. And this decision is still often made by the family. And part of this is a very, very strict control of middle class families and upper class families on the virginity and the chastity of young women. So what that meant for young women is from their early teenage years on was that whenever they are in public, they must be accompanied by some type of chaperone. And this was a confining way of life for these women. So if you can even see it in their clothing, the time period. They're covered from head to toe. Their dresses go all the way to the floor. Their collars go all the way to the neck. They usually have to wear a very large hat. They have lace and such going to their wrists and covering parts of the hands, oftentimes gloves as well. They wear boots that cover the ankles and many layers of clothing underneath. And this has not always been the case for European women, but it's the case during this time period. And again, to be aspiring to be middle class or to be aspiring to the upper class would be the more control you have over your young women and how you control the men as well. And the idea of a good match is a family obsession, that your daughter will marry somebody of a class and stature higher than themselves. And we're in a time period where there is still, ranks of nobility throughout the British Empire and throughout Europe. And it didn't necessarily mean wealth, but a title represents some level of power throughout the time period. So those of a certain class want to marry within that certain class or above, if possible. And sometimes there were to be matches made because of monetary reasons. So new industrialists who would not be of a certain class might be able to break into this group, although there would probably be some whispering and gossip of these issues, but possibly these people could be of a good match as well. And women's lives were completely controlled by this, if they're of that society. So they go to school and they come home and they're constantly watched. They're constantly they're never in the company of men in many cases, unless they have a brother or such. And in some of the readings, you're going to be seeing this in many places, how this affects their daily life. And so when we break up the centuries, and some people talk about when the 20th century begins, sometimes it begins with women's emancipation during World War I and after. So a women's movement had begun on the continent really from the 19th century on, and at different times it has different appeals depending on what nation you're in and how far they can push it. And so there are radical women pushing for changes in voting rights and such. And the first nation that gives women the right to vote is in Norway in 1901. And even today, Norway is a leader when it comes to women's rights and such. The rest of the continent is going to change more slowly depending on the time of the war, etc., and what happens during the war, but not necessarily. Some women, for example, are not going to get emancipated until after World War II, or even later, as in Switzerland in the 1960s. But so sometimes the century is broken up because of this. So we talk about this Victorian kind of control over women and society is going to have a major break after World War I. So that's one of the reasons why we break up the century, that some people will begin it after the war or beginning with the war. That world of straight-laced living, of control and all these things completely breaks down during World War One, and women are given new opportunities because they need to go to the factories and such during the war, and there's a basic revolution of society in Western Europe for women. Although some of those will be retro or retracted later on. Basically, there's a major break in what happens to the lives of women, and this is a major part of the 20th century and what happens in 20th century Europe as well. How society radically changes during World War One. So this cultural mores of how women should lead is pretty continental, and those who are not of these classes aspire to these classes. Even the poorest of the poor would try and mimic the lives of the middle class and such. And this is through acquisition. This is through property and through purchases, and by the number of plates and place settings you can have. The demand for china, for porcelainware, is ever increasing at the turn of the century, because again, these are outward signs for your neighbors about your level of wealth. And do you have 8 place settings? Do you have 12 place settings? 24 place settings? This is all something that you would measure you against your neighbor. And where you lived often in a building reflected your wealth. So the higher up you were in a building, the poorer you were. In America today we think of the penthouse being for the rich, but in a time without elevators, when you had a 5-story building, those at the bottom were the wealthiest. They had the largest space for the least amount of people. Maybe you have a family of 5 on the bottom floor. As you go up, you might begin having renters and workers and such. To the very top of the building, you would have multi-families living in very limited space, often in very squalid conditions. So the top of your building can be this scene of utter poverty, where at the bottom you have the emerging bourgeois middle-class life of fancy dishes and fancy silverware and fine clothing and multiple pieces of clothing and and rich foods and a variety of foods that come from foreign lands. Whereas maybe in the top of your building, you're people who are drinking weak tea and having just a very small slice of salami and bread for dinner in the evening and such. So this juxtaposition of wealth and family and such is often very outward, and I would say today, even in Europe, it's still something that is insisted upon, where people are well dressed, and if you're not rich, you still aspire to be well dressed. Whereas in America, you can be in a fancy restaurant today, for example, and see people who might be very wealthy dressed in jeans and sneakers and such. There's this sense of commonality in America that many rich people try to portray, whereas in Europe, that's not necessarily the case.